This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Robert Browning by G.K. Chesterton. Section 9, Chapter 3, Browning and His Marriage, Part 2. Then began the chief part of that celebrated correspondence which has, within comparatively recent years, been placed before the world. It is a correspondence which has very peculiar qualities and raises many profound questions. It is impossible to deal at any length with the picture given in these remarkable letters of the gradual progress and amalgamation of two spirits of great natural potency and independence, without saying at least a word about the moral question raised by their publication, and the many expressions of disapproval which it entails. To the mind of the present writer, the whole of such a question should be tested by one perfectly clear intellectual distinction and comparison. I am not prepared to admit that there is or can be, properly speaking, in the world anything that is too sacred to be known. That spiritual beauty and spiritual truth are in their nature communicable, and that they should be communicated, is a principle which lies at the root of every conceivable religion. Christ was crucified upon a hill, and not in a cavern, and the word gospel itself involves the same idea as the ordinary name of a daily paper. Whenever, therefore, a poet or any similar type of man can, or conceives that he can, make all men partakers in some splendid secret of his own heart, I can imagine nothing saner and nothing manlier than his course in doing so. Thus it was that Dante made a new heaven and a new hell out of a girl's nod in the streets of Florence. Thus it was that Paul founded a civilization by keeping an ethical diary. But the one essential which exists in all such cases as these is that the man in the question believes that he can make the story as stately to the whole world as it is to him, and he chooses his words to that end. Yet when a work contains expressions which have one value and significance when read by the people to whom they were addressed, and an entirely different value and significance when read by any one else, then the element of the violation of sanctity does arise. It is not because there are many things in this world too sacred to parody. If Browning could really convey to the world the inmost core of his affection for his wife, I see no reason why he should not. But the objection to letters which begin, "My dear Ba," is that they do not convey anything of the sort. As far as any third person is concerned, Browning might as well have been expressing the most noble and universal sentiment in the dialect of the Cherokees. Objection to the publication of such passages as that, in short, is not the fact that they tell us about the love of the Brownings, but that they do not tell us about it. Upon this principle, it is obvious that there should have been a selection among the letters, but not a selection which should exclude anything merely because it was ardent and noble. If Browning or Mrs. Browning had not desired any people to know that they were fond of each other, they would not have written and published One Word More, or the Sonnets from the Portuguese. Nay, they would not have been married in a public church, for everyone who is married in a church does make a confession of love of absolutely national publicity, and tacitly, therefore, repudiates any idea that such confessions are too sacred for the world to know. The ridiculous theory that men should have no noble passions or sentiments in public may have been designed to make private life holy and undefiled, but it has had very little actual effect, except to make public life cynical and preposterously unmeaning. But the words of a poem, or the words of the English marriage service, which are as fine as many poems, is a language dignified and deliberately intended to be understood by all. If the bride and bridegroom in church, instead of uttering these words, were to utter a poem compounded of private allusions to the foibles of Aunt Matilda, or of childish secrets which they would tell each other in a lane, it would be a parallel case to the publication of some of the Brownings' letters. Why the serious and universal portions of those letters could not be published without those which are to us idle and unmeaning it is difficult to understand. Our wisdom, whether expressed in private or public, belongs to the world, but our folly belongs to those we love. There is at least one peculiarity in the Browning letters which tends to make their publication far less open to objection than almost any other collection of love letters which can be imagined. The ordinary sentimentalist who delights in the most emotional of magazine interviews will not be able to get much satisfaction out of them, because he and many persons more acute will be quite unable to make head or tail of 3 consecutive sentences. In this respect it is the most extraordinary correspondence in the world. There seems to be only 2 main rules for this form of letter writing. The first is that if a sentence can begin with a parenthesis, it always should. And second is that if you have written from a third to a half of a sentence, you need never in any case write any more. It would be amusing to watch anyone who felt an idle curiosity as to the language and secrets of lovers opening the Browning letters. He would probably come upon such simple and lucid passage as the following: "I ought to wait, say a week at least, having killed all your mules for you, before I shot down your dogs. But not being Phoebos Apollyon, you are to know further that when I did think I might go modestly on, Greek amoi, let me get out of this slough of a simile, never mind with what dislocated ankles." What our imaginary sentimentalist would make of this tender passage is difficult indeed to imagine. The only plain conclusion which appears to emerge from the words is the somewhat curious one that Browning was in the habit of taking a gun down to Wimpole Street and of demolishing the livestock on those somewhat unpromising premises. Nor will he be any better enlightened if he turns to the reply of Miss Barrett, which seems equally dominated with the great central idea of the Browning correspondence, that the most enlightening passages in a letter consist of dots. She replies in a letter following the above: "But if it could be possible that you should mean to say you would show me dots, can it be, or am I reading this Attic contraction quite the wrong way? You see, I am afraid of the difference between flattering myself and being flattered dots, the fatal difference. And now will you understand that I should be too overjoyed to have revelations from the portfolio dots, however incarnated with blots and pen scratches dots, to be able to ask impudently of them now? Is that plain?" Most probably she thought it was. With regard to Browning himself, this characteristic is comparatively natural and appropriate. Browning's prose was in any case the most roundabout affair in the world. Those who knew him say that he would often send an urgent telegram from which it was absolutely impossible to gather where the appointment was, or when it was, or what was its object. This fact is one of the best of all arguments against the theory of Browning's intellectual conceit. A man would have to be somewhat abnormally conceited in order to spend 6 pence for the pleasure of sending an unintelligible communication to the dislocation of his own plans. The fact was that it was part of the machinery of his brain that things came out of it, as it were, backwards. The words "tail foremost" express Browning's style with something more than a conventional accuracy. The tail, the most insignificant part of an animal, is also often the most animated and fantastic. An utterance of Browning is often like a strange animal walking backwards, who flourishes his tail with such energy that everyone takes it for his head. He was, in other words, at least in his prose and practical utterances, more or less incapable of telling a story without telling the least important thing first. If a man who belonged to an Italian secret society, one local branch of which bore as a badge an olive-green ribbon, had entered his house and in some sensational interview tried to bribe or blackmail him, he would have told the story with great energy and indignation, but he would have been incapable of beginning with anything except the question of the colour of olives. His whole method was founded both in literature and life upon the principle of the expede Herculum, and at the beginning of his description of Hercules the foot appears some sizes larger than the hero. It is, in short, natural enough that Browning should have written his love letters obscurely, since he wrote his letters to his publisher and his solicitor obscurely. In the case of Mrs. Browning it is somewhat more difficult to understand, for she at least had, beyond all question, a quite simple and lucent vein of humour, which does not easily reconcile itself with his subtlety. But she was partly under the influence of her own quality of passionate ingenuity or emotional wit, of which we have already taken note in dealing with her poems, and she was partly also, no doubt, under the influence of Browning. Whatever was the reason, their correspondence was not of the sort which can be pursued very much by the outside public. Their letters may be published 100 times over. They still remain private. They write to each other in a language of their own, an almost exasperatingly impressionistic language, a language chiefly consisting of dots and dashes and asterisks and italics and brackets and notes of interrogation. Wordsworth, when he heard afterwards of their eventual elopement, said with that slight touch of bitterness he always used in speaking of Browning, "So Robert Browning and Miss Barrett have gone off together. I hope they understand each other. No one else would." It would be difficult to pay a higher compliment to a marriage. Their common affection for Kenyon was a great element in their lives and in their correspondence. "I have a convenient theory to account for Mr. Kenyon," writes Browning mysteriously, "and his otherwise unaccountable kindness to me." "For Mr. Kenyon's kindness," retorts Elizabeth Barrett, "no theory will account. I class it with mesmerism for that reason." There is something very dignified and beautiful about the simplicity of these two poets vying with each other in giving adequate praise to the old dilettante of whom the world would never have heard but for them. Browning's feeling for him was indeed especially strong and typical. "There," he said, pointing after the old man as he left the room, "there goes one of the most splendid men living, a man so noble in his friendship, so lavish in his hospitality, so large-hearted and benevolent, that he deserves to be known all over the world as Kenyon the Magnificent." There is something thoroughly worthy of Browning at his best in this feeling, not merely of the use of sociability or of the charm of sociability, but of the magnificence, the heroic largeness of real sociability. Being himself a warm champion of the pleasures of the society, he saw in Kenyon a kind of poetic genius for the thing, a mission of superficial philanthropy. He is thoroughly to be congratulated on the fact that he had grasped the great but now neglected truth that a man may actually be great, yet not in the least able. Browning's desire to meet Miss Barrett was received on her side, as has been stated, with a variety of objections. The chief of these was the strangely feminine and irrational reason that she was not worth seeing, a point on which the seeker for an interview might be permitted to form his own opinion. "There is nothing to see in me, nor to hear in me. I never learned to talk as you do in London, though I can admire that brightness of carved speech in Mr. Kenyon and others. If my poetry is worth anything to any eye, it is the flower of me. I have lived most and been most happy in it, and so it has all my colours. The rest of me is nothing but a root fit for the ground and dark." The substance of Browning's reply was to the effect, "I will call at 2 on Tuesday." They met on May 20th, 1845. A short time afterwards he had fallen in love with her and made her an offer of marriage. To a person in the domestic atmosphere of the Barretts, the incident would appear to have been paralyzing. "I will tell you what I once said in jest," she writes. "If a Prince of El Dorado should come with a pedigree of lineal descent from some signatory in the moon on one hand, and a ticket of good behaviour from the nearest independent chapel in the other, why, even then," said my sister Arbel, "it would not do." And she was right. We all agreed that she was right. This may be taken as a fairly accurate description of the real state of Mr. Barrett's mind on one subject. It is illustrative of the very best and breeziest side of Elizabeth Barrett's character, that she could be so genuinely humorous over so tragic a condition of the human mind. End of section 9.